German U-boat crews surfaced off the American coast in 1942 and couldn't believe the cities were still lit up. Section 1, The Happy Time. January 13, 1942. 11:47 p.m. 40 miles off the coast of Long Island, New York. The Atlantic is black and freezing. A thin crescent moon hangs low over the water, throwing almost no light across the surface. Visibility is poor. The wind is cutting. And somewhere beneath those dark swells, a steel cylinder the length of a city block is rising. Slowly. Silently. The conning tower of U-123 breaks the surface first, seawater cascading off its flanks in white sheets. Then the hull. Then the deck. And then, one by one, the men. Captain-Lieutenant Reinhard Hartigen is first up the ladder, pulling himself into the winter air, his binoculars already around his neck before his boots find the platform. He turns south. And he stops. The horizon is glowing. Not from fire. Not from a burning ship. Not from any kind of military signal or warning flare. The horizon is glowing because New York City, one of the largest, wealthiest, most populated cities on the face of the earth, has not turned off a single light. The skyline pulses in the distance like a distant ember, warm and gold and completely, incomprehensibly exposed. Hartigen raises his binoculars. He can make out the silhouettes of ships moving against the glow. Merchant vessels. Tankers. Their hulls black against the backlit sky, outlined as cleanly as targets on a shooting range. He lowers the binoculars. He almost laughs. Reinhard Hartigen was 32 years old, and by January of 1942 he was already a veteran of some of the most brutal submarine warfare the Atlantic had seen. He had been at sea since before the war, had survived depth charge attacks that collapsed men's eardrums and cracked pressure gauges, and had learned the particular psychology of submarine command, the patience, the silence, the cold calculus of waiting for the right moment. He had expected American coastal waters to be dangerous. Every officer in the Kriegsmarine had. The United States had been at war for exactly 37 days when U-123 crossed into what the Germans called the Paukenschlag operational zone, the area Admiral Karl Donitz had designated for a sudden, coordinated strike along the eastern seaboard. The operation's name translated to Drumbeat. A drumroll before the killing began. Donitz had warned his commanders to expect searchlights, destroyer patrols, coordinated convoy escorts, anti-submarine nets, coastal radar. He had expected the Americans to be ready. They had watched Britain fight for 2 years. They had supplied the Royal Navy. They had seen what U-boats did to Atlantic convoys. What Donitz had not anticipated, what none of them had anticipated, was this. Nothing. No blackout orders. No coastal patrol boats running dark. No air cover sweeping the surface. Just the lights of a nation that did not yet understand, in any visceral or immediate sense, that the war had come to its front door. You have to understand what this looked like from a submarine commander's perspective. In the waters off Britain, operating at night meant threading through layered defensive systems, radar sweeps, escort destroyers, air patrols, acoustic listening posts along the seafloor. A U-boat surfacing in the English Channel was a calculated risk taken only when absolutely necessary, and even then it was a matter of minutes before someone was looking for you. Off the coast of New Jersey in January 1942, Hartigen surfaced and stayed surfaced. He ran on the surface for hours. The watch crew stood on the deck breathing cold salt air while the lights of Atlantic City glittered to the west. They could hear music. Not clearly, but the faint, impossible suggestion of it, drifting across the water from the boardwalk casinos that were still open, still lit, still doing business on a Tuesday night in wartime. One crew member would later recall thinking he had entered some kind of strange dream. Another said it felt like a different planet from the war they had been fighting. Hartigen didn't waste time on the strangeness of it. He was already doing the math. Because moving against that glowing horizon, silhouetted in perfect relief, was a Panamanian-flagged tanker called the Nornis. Fully loaded. Running without a naval escort. Navigating on a predictable coastal shipping lane that hugged the shoreline the way it always had in peacetime, because no one had told her captain to do anything differently. U-123 moved into position. Hartigan gave the order. And the first torpedo of Operation Drumbeat left its tube at 1:24 in the morning. What happened next would not be reported in American newspapers for weeks. But along the eastern seaboard, over the next 4 months, something was coming that the United States Navy was almost entirely unprepared to face. And Hartigan was only the beginning. The Nornis didn't sink immediately. That was the part that never made it into the sanitized wartime press releases. The tanker took the first torpedo at her midsection, and the explosion tore a hole in her hull large enough to swallow a truck. She listed hard to starboard, began taking water, and her crew scrambled for lifeboats in the darkness while burning oil spread across the surface around them. Hartigan circled. Watched. Then sent a second torpedo to finish the job. She went down 40 miles southeast of Montauk Point, New York. 38 men survived. 2 did not make it off the ship. By the time the sun rose on January 14, 1942, the United States Navy's Eastern Sea frontier had received the distress signal, logged the sinking, and begun the process of filing the paperwork that would eventually make its way up the command chain to Admiral Adolphus Andrews, the officer responsible for defending roughly 1,500 miles of American coastline. Andrews had, at his disposal, a grand total of 20 vessels considered fit for anti-submarine patrol. 20. For 1,500 miles of coast. Reinhard Hartigan did not know the precise dimensions of the American naval vacuum he was operating inside. But he could feel it. Every hour that passed without a depth charge, without a patrol aircraft, without so much as a searchlight sweeping the water, told him something important. He was operating in what submariners called a free hunting zone, an area with targets, no defenses, and no consequences. He kept hunting. On the night of January 14, less than 18 hours after sinking the Nornis, U-123 found the British tanker Coimbra running south along the Jersey shore. She was carrying lubricating oil, and when Hartigan's torpedo found her, she exploded with a violence that lit up the coastline for miles. People on the beach at Long Island saw the fireball. Residents along the Jersey shore called their local police departments to report what they thought was some kind of accident or explosion far out at sea. It wasn't an accident. The Coimbra sank in 180 feet of water. Of her crew of 36, only 6 men survived, clinging to wreckage in water so cold that exposure alone was a death sentence. And still, no American anti-submarine response arrived. Hartigan pressed south. This is the part of the story that reads, from a distance of 80 years, as almost surreal. U-123 moved down the American coastline like a predator walking through an unguarded farmyard, and what struck Hartigan and his crew again and again was not the number of targets. It was the light. Every coastal city they passed was fully illuminated. Atlantic City. Cape May. The Delaware Bay approaches. Norfolk, Virginia, home to the largest naval base in the United States, glowed on the horizon with a warmth that seemed almost welcoming. Ships moved against these backlit skylines in perfect silhouette, their hulls and superstructures crisp and dark against the amber glow, their wakes phosphorescent in the cold water. Hartigan's war diary entries from this period have a quality to them that is difficult to categorize. They are professional, clipped, tactical. But occasionally a phrase surfaces that reveals something underneath the discipline. At one point, observing a tanker moving against the lights of the Virginia coast, he wrote simply, "It is easier than the exercises. Easier than the training runs in the Baltic." That sentence should have been classified as one of the most damning indictments of American coastal preparedness ever written. Instead, it sat in the operational log of U-123 while the ship kept moving south and the cities kept burning bright. Back in Washington, the situation was generating friction at the highest levels, but not yet the kind of friction that produces action. Admiral Ernest King, the Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet, a man described by those who served under him as simultaneously brilliant and almost pathologically resistant to outside advice, had received British recommendations on coastal defense convoy systems as early as December 1941. The Royal Navy had spent 2 years developing hard-won doctrine for exactly this kind of threat. They had the data, the losses, the tactical manuals. They sent officers to Washington with the information packaged and ready to implement. King listened, took the reports, and largely declined to act on the convoy recommendations, at least immediately, for reasons that historians have debated ever since. Some argue he was overwhelmed by the scope of America's sudden global commitments. Others suggest institutional pride played a role, an American admiral taking orders, even implicit ones, from the British. Whatever the reason, the eastern seaboard remained essentially undefended. And the U-boats kept coming. Because Hartigan had done something that would extend the carnage far beyond his own patrol. He had broken radio silence and sent encrypted operational reports back to Lorient, France, back to Donat's headquarters, describing what he was finding. The targets. The lack of resistance. The extraordinary, inexplicable gift of the coastal lights. Donitz read the reports and immediately began redirecting every available Atlantic U-boat toward American waters. By the end of January 1942, 5 U-boats were operating off the eastern seaboard. By February, that number had grown. The sinkings mounted so quickly and so consistently that the Kriegsmarine began referring to this period with a phrase that, in its casualness, reveals everything about how one-sided the slaughter had become. They called it Die Gluck-like sight. The happy time. For the men in the water, the merchant sailors burning alive in oil fires off Cape Hatteras, the tanker crews clinging to wreckage in freezing January seas off Long Island, the engineers and deckhands who had signed on to move fuel and rubber and steel and had no weapons and no naval escort and no warning, there was nothing happy about it at all. But that reality was being kept from the American public with a thoroughness that would, in time, become its own scandal. And somewhere off the Carolina coast, another U-boat was already lining up its next shot. The families of Cape Hatteras, North Carolina had a word for what the sea was giving back to them in the early months of 1942. They called it the graveyard. The Outer Banks had always been treacherous water, shallow sandbars, unpredictable currents, the confluence of the cold Labrador Current pushing south and the warm Gulf Stream pushing north, creating a churn that had been swallowing ships since the first European vessels tried to navigate it in the 1500s. Local fishermen knew it. Lighthouse keepers knew it. The maritime charts were covered in wreck markers the way a battlefield map is covered in unit positions. But what was happening in the winter and spring of 1942 was different. This wasn't weather. This wasn't navigation error. This was systematic, and the people who lived along those barrier islands knew it, even before their government was willing to say so out loud. The first sign was the oil. It came ashore in thick black ribbons, coating the beach sand in a slick that stretched for miles in either direction. It fouled the fishing nets. It killed the shorebirds. It coated the wooden pilings of the fishing piers in a layer that didn't wash off for months. Local residents who walked the beach in the early morning began finding other things mixed in with the oil and the seaweed. Life preservers. Wooden hatch covers. Personal effects, a wallet, a boot, a sodden photograph in a waterproof sleeve. And then, with an increasing regularity that began to feel like a kind of horrible tide schedule, the bodies. Merchant sailors, most of them. Men from a dozen different nations, because the ships working the American coastal routes in 1942 carried crews that were Norwegian, British, Dutch, Greek, Panamanian, and American in roughly equal measure. They came ashore in their work clothes, in their sleep clothes, sometimes in life jackets that had kept them floating long enough to drown of hypothermia instead of drowning outright. The local coroner's office in Dare County, North Carolina was overwhelmed within weeks. Undertakers were brought in from the mainland. The residents of Hatteras Island existed in a strange and suffocating information vacuum during this period, and it is important to understand why. The Office of Censorship, established by executive order just 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor, had issued directives to American newspapers prohibiting the publication of specific information about ship losses, U-boat locations, and convoy routes. The reasoning was militarily sound. Broadcasting sinkings in detail would give the Germans a precise picture of their own effectiveness. But the practical effect, along the Outer Banks, was that people were watching tankers burn on the horizon from their kitchen windows, walking past dead sailors on their morning beach walks, and reading newspapers that contained almost none of it. The cognitive dissonance was extraordinary. 17-year-old Aycock Brown, who would later become a well-known photographer and journalist, was living on the banks during this period and kept informal records of what he was seeing, records that couldn't be published but couldn't be unfelt. He described watching a tanker called the WL Steed burn through an entire night in late February 1942, visible from the shore as a column of orange light reflected on the low clouds, and walking to the beach the next morning to find oil and wreckage and 6 bodies in the surf. The WL Steed had been carrying heating oil. She had a crew of 34. 6 men survived. Local women brought blankets to the beach. Local men waded into the surf to pull the dead clear of the waves. Nobody told them to. Nobody organized it. It was simply what you did when the sea gave back what the submarines had taken, and there was no official apparatus yet in place to do it for you. Inland, the war felt like a newsreel. Along the Outer Banks in the spring of 1942, it felt like something else entirely. Hotel owners along the Virginia Beach and Carolina coastlines began receiving complaints from guests about the view, not because it was ugly, but because it was terrifying. Tourists who had come for the sea air and the sand found themselves watching merchant ships burn at night from their balconies, the fires close enough to see the difference between the initial explosion and the secondary burn as cargo caught. Some hotels quietly stopped advertising ocean view rooms. Others went further and simply closed, not because of any official order, but because the psychological weight of the thing made normal tourism feel obscene. And still the coastal lights stayed on. This is the detail that historians return to again and again, because it was not a secret that the lights were a problem. Naval officers knew it. The British had been saying it explicitly since January. Independent shipping company executives had written letters to the Navy Department pointing out that their vessels were being silhouetted against the shore glow and asking, with increasing desperation, what was being done about it. The answers they received back were bureaucratic, procedural, written in the careful language of institutions that have not yet fully processed the scale of what they are failing to address. Meanwhile, in the waters off Cape Hatteras, a stretch of ocean that sailors had already christened Torpedo Junction, a name born not in any official report but in the mess halls and dockside bars where surviving merchant sailors gathered and compared notes, the water was thick with wreckage. In Berlin, Grand Admiral Erich Raeder presented Hitler with the tonnage figures for January and February 1942 at a naval briefing in early March. The numbers were extraordinary. More Allied shipping had been sunk in American coastal waters in 6 weeks than the entire Atlantic U-boat campaign had achieved in the previous 6 months of 1941. Hitler, who had never fully trusted the submarine campaign and had frequently overruled donuts on tactical questions, studied the figures in silence for a long moment. Then he asked why the Americans hadn't turned off their lights. Nobody at the table had a satisfying answer. Because the honest answer, that the most powerful industrial nation on earth had simply not yet made the psychological transition from peacetime to wartime, that the machinery of a free and open society does not shift onto a war footing the moment a declaration is signed, was too complicated and too uncomfortable to deliver to the Führer in a situation briefing. So they moved on to the next item. And off the Carolina coast, the lights burned on. But not, as it turned out, for much longer. Because in Washington, something was finally beginning to move. Not quickly enough. Not without cost. But something. And the man who would ultimately be forced to change everything was sitting in his office at 17th and Constitution Avenue, staring at a set of shipping loss reports that were getting harder and harder to explain away. Ernest Joseph King did not like being told what to do. This was not a personality quirk. It was, by most accounts of the men who served around him, a defining architectural feature of the man himself, as fundamental to his character as the set of his jaw or the cold, appraising quality of his eyes. He was brilliant, and he knew it, and he had spent 4 decades in the United States Navy accumulating the kind of institutional authority that made brilliance dangerous, because there was no longer anyone positioned above him who could comfortably push back. President Roosevelt had appointed King as Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet on December 30, 1941, 23 days after Pearl Harbor, in a decision that was less about affection than about necessity. King was the hardest, sharpest instrument available, and the situation called for hard, sharp instruments. Roosevelt reportedly once said that King was so tough he shaved with a blowtorch. It was meant as a compliment. But toughness, in the winter of 1942, was producing a particular and costly kind of blindness. The British had been running convoys along their coastal waters since 1939. They had learned, at catastrophic expense, the specific mathematics of merchant ship survival, that an unescorted vessel sailing alone was many times more likely to be sunk than the same vessel sailing in a coordinated convoy protected by even a minimal escort screen. The data was not theoretical. It had been purchased in lives and tonnage across 2 years of brutal Atlantic warfare, and by late 1941 the Royal Navy had it codified, documented, and ready to hand to any Allied partner willing to receive it. Rear Admiral Sir Andrew Cunningham had sent a liaison team to Washington in January 1942 carrying precisely this information. They brought convoy routing protocols, escort coordination manuals, communications procedures, the specific lessons learned from the defense of British coastal shipping lanes. They sat across tables from American naval officers and walked them through the doctrine page by page. King received their reports. And then he explained, with the particular courtesy that powerful men deploy when they have already decided not to act, that the situation in American waters was different. That the eastern seaboard presented unique logistical challenges. That the United States Navy did not currently have sufficient escort vessels to implement a full convoy system, and that a partially implemented convoy system, King's phrase, delivered with the confidence of a man who had thought the matter through, might actually be worse than no convoy system at all, because it would concentrate targets for the U-boats rather than dispersing them. The British liaison officers absorbed this argument. They had heard versions of it before, in the early months of their own coastal defense debates. They knew where it led. They went back to their hotel and wrote cables to London that were, by diplomatic standards, barely concealed expressions of alarm. The escort vessel shortage was real. That much is important to acknowledge, because the narrative of American incompetence in the winter of 1942 is sometimes told in a way that strips out the genuine constraints. The United States Navy in January 1942 was simultaneously trying to respond to Pearl Harbor, establish a defensive perimeter across the Pacific, support British operations in the North Atlantic, and begin the long logistical process of projecting American military power across 2 oceans. The demands were staggering and they arrived all at once. But the escort shortage, as the British pointed out repeatedly and with mounting frustration, did not have to be the end of the conversation. Coastal shipping could be routed to move only during daylight hours and anchored in protected inlets at night, eliminating the silhouetting problem entirely. A blackout of coastal cities could be implemented immediately, at zero material cost, simply by issuing the order. Armed trawlers, Coast Guard cutters, even civilian vessels equipped with radios and depth charges could provide a rudimentary but meaningful deterrent presence. Air patrols could be extended and coordinated to cover the most heavily trafficked coastal corridors. None of these measures required a full convoy escort system. None of them required destroyer production that hadn't happened yet. They required, almost entirely, decisions. And decisions were what King was slowest to make, in this particular theater, in these particular months. The men who worked closest to King during this period described an atmosphere in his office that was not conducive to delivering unwelcome assessments. He was not a shouter, that would have been easier to navigate. He was instead a man whose silences carried weight, whose expressions of skepticism could end careers, and whose approval, once withheld, was extraordinarily difficult to recover. Junior officers learned quickly to bring King solutions, not problems, and to frame every piece of bad news inside a framework that suggested the situation was already being managed. The result was that the true scale of the eastern seaboard losses took longer to reach King in actionable form than it should have. Not because the data didn't exist, the sinking reports were filed, logged, and processed through naval intelligence with reasonable efficiency. But the interpretation of that data, the willingness to say plainly that the current approach was failing and something fundamentally different was required, moved slowly through a command culture that had been shaped, from the top down, by the temperament of one man. Meanwhile, in the waters off Florida, the situation was accelerating. By March of 1942, the U-boats had pushed further south, following the shipping lanes into the Florida Straits and the Gulf of Mexico. The waters off Jacksonville and Miami were now producing sinkings with the same horrible regularity that had characterized the Jersey Shore in January. Tourists on Miami Beach, and there were still tourists, because Florida had not yet implemented a blackout either, reported watching burning ships from the shoreline close enough that they could see the flames reflecting on the water. A taxi driver in Miami told a reporter, in a quote that somehow made it past the censors and into a local paper, that the war was close enough to smell. He meant it literally. The oil from sunken tankers was washing ashore on Florida beaches. The smell of it, thick, petrochemical, carrying with it something else underneath that those who had grown up near the sea recognized instinctively, was drifting inland on the sea breeze. In Washington, the shipping loss figures for the first quarter of 1942 were compiled and placed on King's desk. He looked at them for a long time. And then, finally, something shifted. Not a dramatic conversion. Not a public admission of error, King was constitutionally incapable of those. But a quiet, grudging acknowledgement, visible only in the orders that began to move outward from his office in the weeks that followed, that the current approach was no longer defensible. The lights, at last, were about to go out. But the cost of the delay, measured in ships, in oil, in men floating face down in warm Florida water, had already been paid. And somewhere in the accounting of that cost was a question that nobody in official Washington was yet willing to ask out loud. How many of those men would still be alive if the order had come in January? The blackout order for the eastern seaboard did not arrive as a single decisive command. It came in pieces. Grudgingly. Unevenly. The way institutional change always comes when it is being pulled out of a bureaucracy that has not yet fully accepted the need for it, rather than pushed through by leadership that has already made peace with the cost of inaction. In mid-April 1942, the Army, not the Navy, began pressuring coastal municipalities to implement dim-out regulations. The distinction between a dim-out and a full blackout mattered practically. A dim-out meant shielding lights, redirecting them away from the ocean, reducing but not eliminating the coastal glow. A full blackout meant darkness. The Army wanted the dim-out first, as a negotiated middle position, because the political resistance from coastal business owners, tourism boards, and municipal governments had been significant and sustained. The resistance was not irrational, from a purely local economic perspective. Atlantic City's entire identity was built on light. The boardwalk casinos, the hotel marquees, the amusement piers, these were not incidental features of the city's economy. They were the economy. The same was true up and down the coast. Resort towns that had spent decades building themselves around the promise of a glittering oceanfront were being asked to go dark for a threat that their residents couldn't see in any official newspaper, because the censors had spent 4 months making sure they couldn't. The result was a negotiation that should never have been a negotiation at all. Colonel Julius Oakes Adler of the New York Times, a veteran of the First World War and a man who understood both the mechanics of military censorship and the obligations of a free press, had been quietly building a file since February. His reporters along the eastern seaboard were feeding him information that couldn't be printed, accounts from survivors, from Coast Guard stations, from the families of merchant sailors who had stopped receiving letters. The picture that file assembled was, by April, comprehensive enough to be genuinely alarming. Adler made a decision that took a particular kind of institutional courage. He went to the Office of Censorship, not to circumvent it, but to argue that the continued suppression of Eastern Seaboard loss information was now actively harming the war effort. His argument was specific. The American public, kept ignorant of the true scale of the U-boat campaign, had not yet generated the political pressure necessary to force the changes in coastal defense policy that the military situation demanded. Censorship, designed to protect operational security, had instead created a bubble of false normalcy that was allowing the disaster to continue unchecked. It was, in its way, one of the more sophisticated arguments about the relationship between press freedom and national security made during the entire war. The Office of Censorship listened. And then, carefully, in consultation with the Navy Department, began allowing a more honest accounting of the losses to reach the public. The effect was not immediate. But it was real. When American newspaper readers in late April and May of 1942 began seeing, for the first time, cumulative loss figures that gave some shape to what had been happening off their own coastline, the response was not panic. It was anger. A cold, focused, domestic anger of the kind that American political culture generates when ordinary people conclude that they have been failed by institutions that should have protected them. Letters arrived at congressional offices. Questions were asked in committee hearings that naval officers found uncomfortable to answer under oath. The pressure found King's office through channels he could not as easily dismiss as he had dismissed the British liaison teams. It came through Congress, through the Secretary of the Navy, ultimately through the specific kind of political attention that even the most insulated military commander cannot afford to ignore indefinitely. The dim out became a full blackout along most of the eastern seaboard by mid-May 1942. And almost immediately, the geometry of the U-boat war along the American coast began to change. This is the part of the story that the German war diaries capture with an unintentional clarity that makes them almost painful to read in retrospect. U-boat commanders who had been operating off the American coast since January began filing operational reports in May and June of 1942 that document, in the clipped professional language of Kriegsmarine procedure, something that amounts to profound tactical disorientation. The targets were still there. The shipping lanes hadn't moved. But the darkness had returned to the American coastline, and with the darkness came the loss of the single greatest advantage the U-boats had possessed since January, the ability to see without being seen. A commander identified in Donit's war diary only as the captain of U-402 reported in late May that he had surfaced at night off the Virginia coast and found conditions completely changed from his previous patrol 3 months earlier. No ambient light. No silhouetted targets. He had spent 4 hours on the surface scanning dark water before submerging without having fired a single torpedo. His report noted, with a professional bluntness that contained no self-pity, that the hunting conditions that had defined Die Gluck-like Zeit no longer existed in the same form. Hartigan himself had already rotated back to Lorient by this point. His January patrol aboard U-123 had yielded 8 ships sunk and 1 damaged, roughly 53,000 tons of Allied shipping sent to the bottom in a single 2-week operation. He was awarded the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, faded in the German press, and held up as proof of the submarine campaign's potential. He never quite replicated the January patrol. Nobody did. But the blackout, while necessary and overdue, was only one piece of the puzzle. And the U-boats were adaptive. Donitz had not built the most effective submarine force in naval history by assuming that tactical conditions would remain static. Within weeks of the American coastal blackout, the Kriegsmarine had begun adjusting. Patrol routes shifted. Commanders moved further offshore, targeting the deeper water shipping lanes where the silhouetting problem had never been the primary hunting method anyway. New tactics emerged for operating in defended waters: faster approach angles, deeper running depths between attacks, more aggressive use of the thermal layers that confused Allied Aztec sonar. The happy time off the American coast was ending. But the Battle of the Atlantic itself, the larger, longer, more existential struggle for control of the sea lanes that connected the United States to Britain and to the Soviet Union, was nowhere near its conclusion. The tools that would ultimately defeat the U-boat campaign were still being built, still being tested, still being argued over in offices in Washington and London by men who were only beginning to understand the full dimensions of what they were fighting. And in the shipyards of Lorient and Brest and Wilhelmshaven, the U-boats kept coming off the ways. Dönitz had started the war with 57 operational submarines. He had asked Hitler for 300. He hadn't gotten 300. But he was getting more every month, and he intended to use every single one of them. The coast was dark now. But the ocean was still his. The weapon that would ultimately break the U-boat campaign did not come from a single invention, a single battle, or a single decision made in a single room by a single man. It came from accumulation. This is the part of the Second World War that resists the clean narrative arc that documentaries and history books reach for instinctively, because the defeat of the German submarine campaign was not a moment. It was a process, slow, expensive, grinding, purchased in the wreckage of hundreds of ships and the lives of tens of thousands of merchant sailors and naval personnel, that unfolded across 3 years and 2 oceans before it produced anything that looked, from the outside, like victory. But the accumulation had to start somewhere. And in the spring and summer of 1942, while the blackout was finally darkening the American coastline and the political fallout from the happy time was still reverberating through Washington's naval corridors, the pieces that would eventually assemble themselves into a coherent Allied anti-submarine strategy were beginning, slowly and painfully, to find each other. The convoy system came first. King implemented it with the same absence of public acknowledgement that had characterized his resistance to it, which is to say that he simply began doing it without ever quite admitting that the British had been right all along. The Bucket Brigade system, as it was initially called, moved coastal shipping in protected daylight segments between defended anchorages, shepherded by whatever escort vessels could be scraped together from Coast Guard stations, naval bases, and the civilian yacht patrol that had been hastily armed and pressed into service under the nickname the Hooligan Navy. The Hooligan Navy deserves a moment, because it is one of those details that the official histories tend to footnote rather than examine, and it shouldn't be. In the spring of 1942, with destroyer production still months away from closing the escort gap, the United States Coast Guard requisitioned several hundred civilian vessels, sport fishing boats, sailing yachts, motorized cruisers, the kind of craft that wealthy Americans kept in marina slips up and down the eastern seaboard, and converted them for coastal patrol duty. They were armed with whatever was immediately available. Some got depth charges. Some got machine guns. Some got radios and not much else. Their crews were a mixture of Coast Guard regulars, Naval Reserve officers, and civilian volunteers who had walked into recruiting offices with boat handling experience and a willingness to go out in them. They were not, by any serious military calculus, a match for a Type 7 U-boat. But they didn't need to be. They needed only to be present. A U-boat commander who knew that a coastal patrol vessel was operating in his area, even a converted yacht, even something that couldn't actually sink him, had to factor that presence into his calculations. He had to submerge more frequently. He had to spend more time at depth, running on battery power that depleted faster than diesel, moving slower, seeing less. The psychological weight of even a minimal defensive presence was measurably real, and the patrol logs from this period documented in the U-boat's own behavior. The free hunting ground was becoming, incrementally, a defended space. Technology was the second accumulating factor, and it moved on a timeline that felt agonizingly slow to the men waiting for it but looks, from historical distance, remarkably compressed. Airborne radar capable of detecting a surfaced U-boat at night had existed in experimental form since 1940. The British had developed the early versions, improved them through operational experience, and by 1942 were deploying increasingly effective centimetric radar sets in coastal command aircraft that could locate a surfaced submarine in darkness or poor visibility at ranges that made evasion genuinely difficult. The Americans were behind the British in this technology, and the gap mattered enormously in the first half of 1942. But American industrial capacity, once fully directed at the problem, had a way of compressing development timelines that consistently surprised even optimistic projections. By the second half of 1942, American patrol aircraft operating over the Atlantic were being fitted with radar systems that fundamentally changed the calculus of U-boat surface operations. The submarine that had surfaced with impunity off Long Island in January, running on the surface for hours in the confident dark, now had to contend with the possibility that an aircraft it couldn't hear and couldn't see was painting it on a radar screen from 15 miles away. Dönitz understood the implications immediately. His war diary entries from late 1942 document a growing anxiety about Allied radar capability that borders, in places, on obsession. He ordered his commanders to assume that Allied aircraft had radar. He ordered more aggressive use of anti-aircraft armament against patrol planes. He ordered the development of radar detection equipment, the METOX receiver, that could warn a U-boat crew when they were being painted by Allied radar transmissions. It was a measure and countermeasure cycle that would define the technical dimension of the Atlantic battle for the next 2 years, each side racing to outpace the other's adaptations, each innovation buying months rather than permanent advantage. But the third factor, the one that Dönitz feared most deeply and understood most clearly as an existential threat to the entire submarine campaign, was not technology. It was mathematics. Specifically, it was the mathematics of production. The United States had entered the war with a shipbuilding capacity that was already formidable. Under the pressure of wartime mobilization, directed by men like Henry Kaiser, whose Richmond yards had pioneered the prefabricated assembly methods that were cutting Liberty ship construction times from months to days, that capacity was expanding at a rate that had no historical precedent. In 1941, American shipyards produced approximately 1 million tons of new merchant shipping. In 1942, that figure rose to over 5 million tons. In 1943, it exceeded 13 million tons. Read those numbers again slowly, because they contain the entire story of why the U-boat campaign ultimately failed. Dönitz submarines were sinking Allied shipping at a rate that would have been strategically decisive against any fixed or slowly growing merchant fleet. Against a fleet that was expanding at 13 million tons per year, the mathematics simply didn't work. You cannot win an attrition campaign against an enemy whose replacement rate exceeds your kill rate and is accelerating while yours is not. Dönitz knew it. He had known it, in some form, since the reports from Hartigan's January patrol had made clear that American industrial capacity was real and visible and operating at a scale that German strategic planning had consistently underestimated. But knowing it and having an answer for it were different things. By the autumn of 1942, the eastern seaboard had transformed almost beyond recognition from the open hunting ground of January. Convoys moved in organized columns with proper naval escorts. Coastal air patrols flew regular schedules over the primary shipping lanes. The lights of the resort towns were dimmed or extinguished. The informal intelligence network of coastal observers, lighthouse keepers, Coast Guard beach patrols, the crews of the hooligan navy, had been formalized and integrated into a coastal warning system that could get information about a surfaced submarine to a response asset within minutes rather than hours. The last major U-boat sinking in the immediate coastal zone off the American eastern seaboard occurred in July 1942. After that, the submarines moved deeper into the Atlantic, south toward the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico, where the convoy system had not yet been fully implemented and the hunting remained, for a while longer, relatively uncontested. Then further still, back toward the mid-Atlantic gap, the area beyond the range of land-based air cover from either side of the ocean where convoys had to travel for days without air protection and where Dönitz concentrated his wolf packs for the battles that would define 1943. But that is a different story, fought in different water, by men who had learned, at terrible cost, the lessons that the eastern seaboard had written in oil and fire across the first 6 months of the American War. The coast that Hartigan had found blazing and undefended on a January night was dark now, and quiet, and watching the sea. The happy time was over. What came next would be harder for everyone. The final accounting of Operation Drumbeat was not done in a single report, filed in a single office, on a single day. It was assembled slowly, the way damage assessments always are after a disaster that nobody wants to fully own, pieced together from ship manifests and survivor testimonies and Coast Guard incident logs and the quiet, persistent work of naval historians who spent decades after the war pulling the true numbers out of archives that had been classified, misfiled, or simply never properly organized in the first place. When the full picture finally came into focus, it was worse than most Americans had been allowed to understand during the war itself. And it remains, to this day, one of the least examined catastrophes in the history of American national defense. Between January and July of 1942, German U-boats operating in American coastal waters and the Caribbean sank approximately 400 Allied ships. 400. In 6 months. In waters that the United States Navy was specifically responsible for defending. In a theater where the enemy had no air cover, no surface fleet support, no resupply infrastructure closer than the coast of France. Where the entire tactical advantage the U-boats possessed, the only advantage, the one that made the whole operation possible, was a coastline full of lights that nobody had ordered extinguished. The tonnage figures are staggering even now. Roughly 2 million tons of Allied shipping went to the bottom in American coastal waters and the Gulf of Mexico during this period. That included tankers carrying aviation fuel desperately needed in the Pacific theater, cargo vessels loaded with war materials bound for Britain and the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease, and passenger ships converted for troop transport that were carrying men toward a war that was already consuming them faster than the training camps could replace them. The human cost sits underneath those tonnage figures like a foundation. Approximately 5,000 merchant sailors died in American coastal waters during the first 7 months of 1942. 5,000 men. Largely forgotten. Largely uncelebrated. Because the merchant marine occupied a peculiar and uncomfortable position in the American war, its members were not military personnel in the formal sense, which meant they were not entitled to military benefits, not covered by the GI Bill, not officially recognized as veterans until an act of Congress in 1988, 46 years after they died in American waters doing work that the Allied war effort could not have survived without. Some of them were teenagers. Some were men in their 50s who had been sailing cargo routes their entire working lives and had signed on to wartime service because it paid better and because nobody had explained to them, with any real specificity, what the new risk profile looked like. None of them had been given naval escorts. Many of them had been sent out without so much as a radio frequency to report a submarine contact. The question of accountability settled, as it usually does in American institutional life, into a shape that satisfied almost nobody. Admiral King was never formally censured for the Eastern Seaboard failures. He remained Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet for the duration of the war, and his overall record, which included genuine strategic brilliance in the Pacific Campaign and a crucial role in the eventual defeat of the U-boat campaign in the North Atlantic, was judged, by the men who made such judgments, to outweigh the specific and costly failures of the winter and spring of 1942. History has been somewhat less forgiving. Samuel Eliot Morison, the official historian of United States naval operations in the Second World War and a man who had access to documents and personnel that no outside researcher could match, was unusually blunt in his assessment of the Eastern Seaboard disaster. He described the period as the most grievous defeat ever inflicted on American naval power, a phrase that carries specific weight coming from a man whose job was, in part, to write institutional history that the Navy could live with. Morison's assessment has held up. Military historians examining the Eastern Seaboard campaign in the decades since have consistently concluded that the losses were not an inevitable consequence of America's unpreparedness at the moment of entry into the war. They were, in substantial part, a consequence of specific decisions, and specific failures to decide, made by specific men in positions of authority who had access to better information and better options than they chose to act upon. That is a harder thing to memorialize than a battle lost against overwhelming odds. Reinhard Hartigan survived the war. This is worth stating plainly, because it is not the ending the narrative logic of the story seems to demand. He was not killed in some subsequent patrol, did not meet a symmetrical fate in the waters he had hunted so freely. He survived, rotated out of active submarine command in 1943 as the Allied anti-submarine campaign made survival rates for U-boat crews increasingly untenable, and lived until 2018, dying at the age of 105 in Bremen, Germany. In his later years he gave interviews. He attended naval history conferences. He was, by all accounts of those who met him, a courteous and thoughtful old man who spoke carefully about the war and about his role in it, who expressed genuine regret for the deaths of the merchant sailors his patrols had caused, and who never quite escaped the particular historical weight of being the man whose January 1942 patrol had opened the door to one of the most preventable naval disasters in American history. He was asked, more than once, whether he felt any moral responsibility for what had happened in American waters during the happy time. His answers were careful. Professional. He had been a naval officer doing his duty under orders in a war his country had started. The merchant sailors had been, in the calculus of submarine warfare, legitimate targets. He had not enjoyed killing them. He had done his job. Whether that answer satisfies is a question each person who hears it has to resolve privately. The 5,000 men who didn't make it home from American coastal waters in 1942 left behind a specific and localized geography of grief that is still visible, if you know where to look. In the small churches of the Outer Banks, where memorial plaques were added to walls that already carried the names of men lost to the sea in peacetime. In the maritime museums of New Jersey and Virginia and Florida, where artifacts recovered from the wrecks, navigation instruments, personal effects, fragments of hull plating, are displayed in cases with the careful, respectful neutrality of objects that carry more weight than their physical substance suggests. In the water itself, where the wrecks remain, lying in depths between 60 and 300 feet off the American coast, preserved in the cold dark, visited now by recreational divers who descend through blue-green Atlantic water to find the enormous, encrusted hulls sitting exactly where they came to rest on the bottom in 1942. The fish have colonized them. The coral has softened their outlines. From certain angles, at certain depths, with the light filtering down from the surface, they look almost peaceful. They are anything but. They are the physical remainder of a failure of imagination and institutional will that cost 5,000 people their lives in American waters, within sight of American shores, while the cities burned bright and the censors kept the newspapers clean and the admirals wrote careful letters to each other about the logistical challenges of convoy implementation. The lights went out eventually. Too late for the men who needed them to go out in January. Operation Drumbeat ended not with a declaration or a ceremony but with the simple, grinding fact that the conditions that had made it possible no longer existed. The coast was dark. The convoys were running. The escorts were multiplying. The aircraft were finding submarines that had once been invisible. Donitz moved his wolf packs east and south, toward water where the old advantages might still hold for a while longer. Some of them did. The North Atlantic battles of 1943 were ferocious and costly in ways that make the Eastern Seaboard campaign look almost simple by comparison. But the happy time, the specific, extraordinary, historically unique period when a handful of German submarines had surfaced off the most powerful nation on Earth and found it lit up like a carnival, undefended and astonished, was finished. It had lasted exactly 6 months. It had cost more than it needed to. And the ocean off the American coast, dark and cold and finally, belatedly watchful, kept its dead.